Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Mundy, another individual, thank you, who I had a chance to meet with last night, and his talk is on increasing social attention in learning. So we're going from the environment and how that might cause autism, and as doctor said, maybe have some preventive and treatment strategies as well, but this is really the environment focusing on treatment and a specific aspect of that. Dr. Mundy has been working for a long time on autism in young children, older children, over 29 years. He's published papers on empirical and theoretical aspects of development, social attention, social cognition in children with autism, and typically developing children. His work has contributed to significant advances in our understanding and also in treatment for young children. And his current research is designed to advance the understanding and also the treatment. Again, it's very important here that we're looking not only to find out new information, but to as quickly as possible translate that into effective strategies for helping you and children with autism in learning, social emotional development, and higher functioning children with autism. So he's moved from a lot of work with younger children to older children. He's going to share some of his insights this morning on the environment and treatment. Dr. Mundy.
It'll come up. Yeah. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think that you know, living in this community, you're all fortunate to have GAN and the other groups that organize this, and then you're also fortunate to have this facility, which is pretty much the best one that I've seen for presentations such as this. What I'd first like to do is just let you know that I'm from the Mind Institute. I'm also at the School of Education, so what I try to do is work with sort of medical models, neurodevelopmental models of autism, translate that back into things that we can do in education, but also help people in education understand that neuroscience and developmental science are fairly important for understanding teaching. I also work with the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities at the Mind Institute, which is part of the reason I'm here, because that center is dedicated to bringing information to communities, both in California, the nation, and worldwide. Let's just talk about, 29 years. I've actually now been 30 years. I probably wrote that a year ago. So I've been working in autism for a long time. I'd just like to give you just a brief sense of history occasionally with some of the slides that I'm going to present. And so as Irva said, Kanner, was one of the first people to describe autism, Asperger, a year later in Austria. Kanner said that this was basically a biological disturbance of affective contact with others. And then, fairly quickly we understood that it was biological pretty much from the beginning, although that's gone back and forth over decades. But the biological perspective of autism has stood the test of time. And then, as Irva said, we began to get into genetic models as we understood that, if you look at twins and monozygotic twins, you see that there's concordance there to a greater degree than you would, and those were the early genetic studies, and now we're at the metabolic level of actually trying to identify genes. And as we have heard, many candidate genes have been identified, but nothing so specific that we can really account for more than 5 to 10% of the variance in autism. Then, sometime in the mid-90s when people started to look at embryological work, and Irva mentioned Patricia Rogier, who was looking at thalidomide and something called the Mobius syndrome, and began to really convince people that it was worthwhile looking at embryological effects. That was one of the kickstarts. But now, in the last decade, with Irva and others like her, so that science of the environment of autism has really started to bear fruit and become a mature science. And it, as Irva will no doubt agree, it should have been a science that was ongoing from the 60s, if not earlier. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is, there's different aspects of the environment. There's the environment that affects us outside in, and then there are things that we do or things that are inborn that also create environmental impact. And so a good example here is a very robust sensory disturbance. If you're blind, your environment is pretty different, right? But that's not an environmental effect that's coming inward. It's an impairment that's then leading to a big change in the environment for you, lifelong, relative to other people. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about autism and thinking about autism in part as an attention disturbance, a particular type of attention disturbance, where the inborn, probably biologically based difference of attention regulation, or at least what's interesting to look at for these kids, really changes a lot of the environmental input for them, changes the environmental input early on in a critical period. And once we began to understand that, we began to have new tools and at least new ideas about how to intervene with young children and hopefully older children with autism. That research has been going on since 1981 when I joined UCLA, so a long period of time. One of the other really important changes in the understanding of autism has been the change in the incidence, or the prevalence at least. We don't know too much about incidence yet, incidence being the change over time, prevalence being the numbers of children at any one time. What we understand, though, is that, it looks like there's been a real change in incidence. Now we have a surveillance system. I mean, there's a couple ways, time series studies, and also surveillance. Surveillance goes out and counts kids every year, or every other year, the same way, in the same age groups, to try to understand if there are changes. We now have a national surveillance system, and I'll show you the website for that in just a second. But you can see the data behind me for 2004, 2006, and it's going to come out every couple years now. And basically, these are 11 to 16 states where researchers go out and count every child, every 8-year-old child, in a catchment area of at least 50,000 children, to determine what the prevalence of autism is that year. And we do this over and over again to see if things are shifting. And you can see that things have shifted a little bit, 8 in 1,000, and then up to 9 in 1,000 in 2006. But what I want to point out is another big change that just doesn't get any press at all. Right now, when we look at these estimates, when we look at hundreds of thousands of children and estimate the number of children with autism in those hundreds of thousands, we see that a lot of the children no longer are affected by intellectual and developmental disabilities. When I started in 1981, we thought that perhaps 25% of children with autism were not also affected by intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now you can see we're talking about, in the latest estimate, 59% of children with autism are not affected by intellectual and developmental disabilities. Whenever you see a number like that up on a board, put 10 on either side. That's usually a good estimate of the reliability, the confidence interval. So we're talking about 49 to 69, something like that. Maybe 50% of kids. That's a huge shift. We don't know why that's occurred. Anything that we think about in terms of environmental effects, changes in measurement and ascertainment, we have to understand why some children are affected by intellectual disabilities and why some aren't, and why there's been such a big change in the proportion of children with autism who aren't. And regardless of what's causing that, that's a very good thing to be happening, right? If you're affected by autism, it's much better to have typical levels of intellectual development rather than less typical levels. So this is the ADAM project. It's just there for your information. You can go on, you can Google ADDM, get right to the site, follow exactly what's going on with the ADAM project. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, try to define some of the real early behavioral problems. Behavioral problems in autism are both a symptom and a cause, and we have to think about that. So when we try to address symptoms, if we're lucky enough to decrease the symptoms early on, we can sometimes have cascading effects that improve outcomes, because symptoms can be causes as well as reflections of a disorder. What else I'd like to talk about is that we want to understand how this thing called joint attention, it's a particular type of attention, how that affects learning and how it affects cognitive development. And I want to talk about whether or not we've begun to understand how to intervene with that particular but very important, sometimes people call it a pivotal component of autism. And then if we have time, and I think we probably will have time, I'd like to talk about school-age children, what social attention is like there, and whether or not that's connected to learning in autism. You know, that's the big frontier. We've made a lot of headway in a lot of areas: environmental science, preschool, understanding preschool development intervention. We now need to translate what we know from preschool intervention into school age in order to continue the care and optimize treatment effects for children with autism. So, you know, again, Kanner was a primary person of the primary, there were two, you know, as I said, and he talked about a biologically based disturbance of affective contact with others. One of the things that slowed us down for a long time in research with autism is we didn't take that seriously. We didn't take any of it seriously, really, but we certainly didn't take the idea that it was a social disturbance seriously. So that through the 70s, there was no research, and I'm not just saying there was no research on social development of children with autism. We had no understanding of what defined the social deficits of autism through the 70s. We began to get a better idea in the 80s. So that woman, Pat Howland, published that study in 1978. There were 6 empirical papers through 1978 on describing the social nature of the deficits of kids with autism. She republished the paper, redid it 8 years later, and by that point there was about 100 papers. It's taken a while. It was one of the things that really delayed the science of autism, unfortunately.